Hello, everyone, to this talk. As you trickle in, I'm Emily Deach. I am the co-president of the Brown Club of DC and want to warmly welcome you to this uniting across the miles of the Brown Clubs of New York and DC. As everyone filters in, we'll start in a few moments, but wanted to introduce myself and also this talk. We are so pleased to have this kind of conversation across the miles, as it were, around one of the most uniting things on the planet, which is, of course, food. And to have two alums who bring from their entrepreneurial lens a sense of their cultural identities, their sense of values that they bring to their vision for the future of food. So that's Jeffrey Yoskowitz, from the class of 2007. He's based in New York. And we also have Miheer Khona, who did his executive MBA at Brown in 2020, and he's here in the DMV area. So we'll meet them in just a moment, but I wanted to give a note about the format of the conversation and how you can engage. So we will have an informal conversation among the three of us, Miheer and Jeffrey and myself, for the first part of the conversation. During that time, please, by all means, add your questions and comments to the chat section, not the Q&A, the chat section. And as best we can, we'll interweave those comments and questions into our conversation, but we'll have dedicated time at the end where we can kind of address them and kind of really get into that. So again, we want to hear from you. Please, please put your thoughts and questions into the chat box. So I want to bring on screen, if I may, Jeffrey and Miheer. There they are. Hello.
Hello, hi.
Hi, hi.
Hello.
Greetings from across the miles. So, my friends, we wanted in this conversation to touch on, as I mentioned before, cultural identity, values, the future of food through your particular lenses as folks who are kind of working and thinking about this space for entrepreneurship. And you each bring something a little different to the table. So I wanted to kind of begin and sort of let folks get to know you a bit with a question about what are those cultural backgrounds that you bring? Jeffrey, you from a Jewish background, Miheer having grown up in Mumbai, and also then the Virginia area. Can you talk a little bit about your backgrounds and kind of what you bring to the table, literally, in food?
Jeffrey, please.
Yeah, I had a feeling you're gonna pass the buck. No, I'm glad, excited to get started. Hi everyone, so excited to be here, and really nice to see some fellow classmates of mine from Brown 07 on here. So thank you for showing up. I come from a Jewish family. I came from the New York area. I'm from New Jersey. I live in Brooklyn right now, and I would say. Many cultures, I'm sure, feel their family, it's always about food, right? I'm not sure it's something that's pretty universal, but I would say in Jewish families, there's a particular way that food is enjoyed. There's actually a term that was coined called food joy. And it's a particular kind of joy in gathering around a table that comes from a place of trauma or past poverty. And I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. Three of my grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust. One escaped before from Poland. And there was a way that our family came alive around the table, around meals. And it's also when we heard stories of where we came from. And so I would say that growing up, I would hear my grandmother, Grandma Ruth, who's still with us. She's 94, lives in New Jersey now, but she was spent most of her adult life after coming to this country up in the Boston area. And she would tell stories about life before the war, during and after. And I just remember always connecting all of my heritage and sense of self to the foods we were eating as we were told these stories. And so I always hold that. And I would say, my father grew up in Brooklyn, and I'd go into the city, and we'd go to a Broadway show, but we always went to a Jewish deli beforehand, right? And there's a term, the Jewish deli is known as the secular synagogue. And this was, I went to an actual synagogue, but to be a culturally Ashkenazi Jew, so a Jew from Eastern European origin, to go to the Jewish deli was a kind of sanctuary. And to see my father order, like this kid from Brooklyn who moved to the suburbs, he would literally shake while holding his menu out of excitement, because it was his connection to his past, to his younger self, to his family. So there's a way that I'd say my Jewish culture really placed me in so many ways. And at the same time, there's tensions within that. And my father's mother turned out to be a vegetarian and a health nut in the 1960s, who essentially was really at the cutting edge around thinking about what we eat and what we put in our body and how it affects us. And so for my father, the deli was also kind of rebellion, kind of a fetishization of meat, and as a rejection of his mother. And so so I always carry these tensions with me. And my own mother had some health problems and adopted a healthy diet when I was maybe a teenager. And so in our home, we were always kind of going between the foods of our culture and heritage and this notion of health. And I would say, as I got into the food world, I was always thinking, and I was always holding these two parts of myself and parts of my identity. And a lot of my work, we'll talk later, is kind of learning more about how they're actually not so dissimilar. And there's actually ways that of misunderstanding of my own food culture, and how American Jews have misunderstood their culture to be eating maybe in a way that's such a departure from how the foods were once eaten back in the old country. But I'll leave it there, and here I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful, Jeffrey. I'm actually envious and intrigued, with all this sort of the aspects, the cultural aspects that you just talked about, right? So coming from a Indian background and growing up in a Jain sort of spiritually, religiously sort of family. Food was kind of always interesting in the way that, on one hand, growing up in Bombay, as I affectionately, still know it, street food there is like that's where, energy is. That's where a lot of the fun is. And so my dad, he would take us out, with my grandparents, and, my mom's like, she's, sort of, she enjoys, sort of the street food scene as well. But culturally, again, food was sort of always one of the elements when we immigrated to the US. My parents actually worked 2 jobs each. And however, at every single day, lunch or dinner, whether it was something for me to, take to school, or, when my sister and I came back, it was always fresh, natural. And, those words didn't really mean anything, right? Like food just magically showed up, and it was always sort of, made, the same day and consumed the same day. So leftovers not really, weren't really part of life. And so that's how I kind of grew up with food. And more recently, it was funny. I was chatting with, who I think now is a mentor and a friend, I can probably say, who's a chef, and, got introduced by Emily. And, him and I were on Zoom, and I think I mentioned to Jeffrey and Emily previously, he just kind of paused, and he was pondering, and he just said, natural used to mean something here, right? And that sort of, that took me back, and, made me think about, what really is comfort food. Like when we think of comfort food, respectively, different cultures and whatnot, and then thinking about the science behind it, which is even more fascinating, right? Like there's a whole neuroscience, when you take a bite out of a food, dessert for me, like I have a massive sweet tooth. And so taking a bite out of something, it takes me back to a specific memory, which was comforting, right? So those are sort of, and then there's a whole trust element, from the background that I have in tech and cybersecurity specifically. So looking at food, again, we'll get into the conversation. But yeah, food is life. It's fun. It brings people together, different cultures. There's a lot to talk about. So I'll leave it at that for now.
There's too much to talk about. I think we all know that we're going to have a difficult time packing this conversation into an hour, and that's an embarrassment of riches, right? We'll leave this, hopefully all of the three of us and then everyone who's on this wanting to continue the conversation. So that's the best of all things. But Miheer, kind of building on what you just said there in terms of kind of the natural element of food and food values. So bridging from your backgrounds to the values that you both are thinking about in terms of your ventures. Jeffrey, with kind of the kinds of food ventures that you're doing on the ground as a cook, as a writer, critic. Miheer, you're kind of in the stealth phase of a food startup, right? That has a certain set of values in play. So one of the things that we all talked about, because in the Venn diagram center of the two of you is an interest in plant-based eating and plant-based food, but the three of us thought, well, that's so overdone. What else could we possibly talk about at the moment? And we came upon a common interest in expanding access, not just to plant-based food, but quality food, period, to everyone, not just vegans, not just people who have committed passionately for the rest of their lives to this form of eating. You're thinking more expansively and inclusively about that. So could you each kind of talk about your approaches and why you think that's the way to go?
Yeah, definitely. No, thanks for that, Emily. So access, right? That's huge. And actually, I just got back from a trip to India. I stayed in an ashram, and it was a phenomenal experience. It was sort of in a bubble and whatnot. I got to explore Mumbai a little bit, but just given the current environment, I was kind of restraining myself not to be too adventurous. But when we think about access, we're in a privileged sort of, I think, place, especially with I think with this group and this discussion, in a sense, because we have the ability to just go to a grocery store and things just naturally show up, and we have an option to select how natural and organic and wholesome and all these kind of different variants of food types that we can consume. But it's the access, I think, in the day and age of instant gratification, right? When we think about what the smartphone has done, it's sort of taken us, as a species, to wanting something quick and fast. And again, thinking about the evolution of the food system and what that means today, right? Over a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system, current food systems in the world. And so thinking about how do we, increase access, but also on the capacity side, there are some tremendous chefs. I mean, Jeffrey, you're doing some phenomenal work, honestly, and, from the story about pickles and, the time that you've spent at the farm that we've talked about, so there are tremendous individuals, right? Chefs, restaurateurs, even, that need exposure, because individuals crave healthy but yet fun, right? And tasty, flavorful, just fulfilling, comforting foods. And so how do we sort of think about that? And so thinking about going sort of in that direction, that's really out of selfishly out of personal need, One day I was kind of sitting around with my sister and my brother-in-law, and we're twiddling our thumbs. We're like, what are we doing for dinner? And, my niece and nephew are like, they're like, yeah, whatever, just pick something. And, it turned out that we always, living in the suburbs or wherever we are, right, in our respective areas, unless you're in an urban environment, access even, it takes a little bit of time, right? So there's 30, 45 minutes typically for, getting to a good restaurant, unless you're in New York City. Jeffrey's got an awesome, density, and even Emily living in DC. But access to, again, these sort of good foods, right, is a challenge. And so what we're actually looking at is a platform that looks at how do we address sort of this challenge with the time aspect, right? There's a structural integrity of the food. If you're ordering crunchy tacos for delivery, they're going to show up soft tacos, right? So you don't want that. And so how do we think about people's demand, right? This instant gratification. Then there's other challenges, from the labor sort of context. And again, the supply chain, the trust and authenticity of, the ingredients that go into the food, right? We were just joking right before the start with the plant-based, alternatives, that exist. And, not all plant-based foods are good and healthy. And so how do we kind of think about, these are kind of a lot of the challenges that we've been thinking about, and very complementary to what, Jeffrey right now is working on. So, that's sort of, thinking about it from, at least from my perspective. But yeah, Jeffrey, I'd love to kind of hear
Yeah, thanks, Miheer. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about access and so many ways to take it. And I can say that, similar to Miheer, I've been thinking a lot about access in terms of delivery from restaurants, just because this is sort of one of the trends of the past few years with COVID and with difficulty of restaurants essentially reaching their customers and having to, people can't just come in. So I've been thinking about it in that way. I have, of course, like Miheer said, worked on farms or I worked on an organic farm in Northwest Connecticut, and we were always struggling. How do we get our really good food to the people? How do we do that? But in terms of the project, one of the projects I'm working on now, it's a company called Papaya, and it's one of our contentions is that essentially it's an underserved market. There's a lot of people who are trying not to eat meat. There are a lot of vegans, or we call them just plant curious people, is a term we use. My mother is someone who suddenly started being interested in eating less meat and more plants after a lifetime of not really ever always being obsessed with protein and having enough protein. And now she's thinking a lot about changing her diet. So there's this trend that's happening, and there's been this trend of food delivery. And it's been interesting is my business partner, who's actually an old friend of mine, he was working in food tech, and he became vegan, and he was used to ordering from all these DoorDashes and Seamless in New York, and all these places. And he would order, and he had a fairly easy experience. But when he went vegan, there was no trust anymore, and he didn't know where to go to find, really good dishes. Because sometimes the classic vegan restaurants from 20 years ago aren't always healthy, like you were saying, Miheer. They're just usually comfort foods, a lot of burgers and fries and things, which don't always travel so well. And he suddenly noticed that he had no access to a really good supply or to good food like he used to have, that he could also feel comfortable with. And so we've been working together to just to essentially increase access to and supply of really high quality foods that happen to be in plant-based, but that aren't necessarily, specifically fake. Like KFC just launched their Beyond Chicken Nuggets this past week, or actually just a few days ago. And so beyond that, and one of the things I noticed working in the food world and working with lots of chefs was that some of the best vegetarian or vegan meals I've ever eaten were made by chefs who just put their attention for a moment. Really good chefs, not vegan chefs, who put their attention, maybe just for one night or for an event, onto making one really good dish that had no animal products in it. And I got so familiar with eating this way, and I realized that you have to know where to go, where to look. You have to know which chefs. A good friend of mine is a chef in Philly. He during the pandemic, he started making instead of his usual fine dining menu, he started making cheesesteaks. He's a Philly chef, but he made the best cheesesteak you could ever find, and he made a vegan cheesesteak as part of it. He called his company is called Frizzwit for anyone in Philly, and his vegan Frizzwit is what he calls his cheesesteaks, was called the Shroomwit. And he spent a lot of time figuring out what can I do for a cheese sauce. He didn't want to just melt down some kind of fake cheese. So he developed a sauce. He actually was using all these umami flavors. He was actually brought in beer and yeast extract in there, and he was playing to find something that was just good to him. And he now is actually about to be named the best vegan sandwich in Philadelphia coming next month. And his cheesesteaks are considered the best cheesesteaks in all of Philly. But that kind of attention was so compelling to me. And so one of the things we're doing with Papaya is we're building a curated marketplace, sourcing restaurants that we call them plant-forward restaurants that just have some of these really great dishes you maybe wouldn't know to go look for, if you were just on one of these delivery platforms. And like you were saying, Miheer, really thinking about how do we also plan these menus for delivery that are meant to be delivered, so that the food will actually be a good experience when it comes to you, and not just like I ordered recently a soggy. Well, I ordered a taco. I didn't order a soggy taco, but I got a soggy taco. And I was really curious because this place said we deliver tacos, and they specialized in tacos. And I felt like if they specialize in it, maybe it'll come and it'll work. But I got a soggy taco. So some things just don't deliver well, and you have to really think that through. And so we're working with restaurants to really help them develop these curated menus. And we had a beta in the fall where we just did these, we call them drops. We just did these pop-ups. Essentially, and they were for delivery or for takeout, and we were actually supplying compostable containers that were sturdy and strong to the restaurants, and really thinking through ways we can bring sustainability beyond just the food into the experience. And now we're working on building a more robust but still very highly curated marketplace where you can go and order from a number of restaurants that we're not just selecting the restaurants, we're curating the menus completely and giving our stamp of trust. We're actually talking through the process to make sure that you're going to know there's no dairy or no meat, and we're going to tell you which kitchens are completely vegan kitchens, which ones are multi-use kitchens, and trying to really give that sense of access for the customer for the diner to transparency in the process. And so that's how I've been thinking about it lately.
Mm-hmm. Jeffrey, I'm just stuck on the soggy taco. I'm so sorry, my friend.
There is nothing, I'm going to say this, there's nothing worse, especially in the world of hospitality. So we come at this food space from different places. I come more from the culinary side of things. I actually just had an experience over the week, over New Year's, where I was supposed to do an in-person 8-course tasting event in Philly at a restaurant for New Year's, and over the course of 2 days, and because of Omicron, it became one night, delivery and takeout, 4 courses, and we had to quickly adapt our menu to be delivery and takeout. But it's not that easy. You have to think completely differently. But as a hospitality person, I want everyone to have a really good experience. We had to try how to figure out how do you also bring whimsy into the experience. Like we were planning on walking around and giving everyone shots of special vodkas. We were essentially going to be infusing with different flavors and to kind of create an experience and a vibe. And we were trying to think, how can we translate that to that delivery experience, while also making sure not to have a soggy taco-like experience as well. And it was not easy. And we tried to put little treats in. And with Papaya, we created playlists to go along with every single meal, and we provided a little coaster with a QR code and with input from the restaurant to kind of get the vibe of the restaurant to try to create that experience. But thinking about what hospitality is, I think about it in terms of the underserved, the vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free, special diet folks. It's really hard to go out and eat. It's really hard. And I know this, and Miheer, I know you know it from growing up. I grew up eating kosher. And so I only went to restaurants and ordered vegetarian, but I wouldn't order meat, but I would always ask if things had meat in them. I always said I was groomed to be the annoying asker of waiters. But I had to ask what kind of stock is in the soup. And so in some ways I'm well set up for the work I'm doing now, but I was very, it's really, as someone who's also cooked a lot of meals, and I'm with my company, Gefilteria, I've done a lot of these pop-up dinners and a lot of these restaurant experiences. And we always would try to have options for everyone that's going to come, but it can be really overwhelming to have 5 or 6 different options too. But you want to make sure everyone has a good time and eats well. So these are the tensions that you really feel as someone in hospitality right now.
That's an interesting point, Jeffrey, just to pick on that too, right? It's our experiences, right? For example, a kosher meal, or ordering menu or ordering vegetarian, sorry, right? So, I think there's a sort of a compassionate perspective, that I think is developed in, the respective, companies that we're both building, right? And so there's a sense of compassion. There's the sense of sort of empathy, understanding, that there are dietary restrictions, and there are individuals who struggle, right, to get good, clean sort of foods that don't have this cross-contamination issues. So again, this concept of trust and authenticity, right? The basis for that really is the compassion and the empathy, right? And that's how we, with again, we're sort of in stealth, hopefully launching Q1 this year, but a lot of these coming from a cybersecurity point of view, identity, right, is sort of a big aspect in authenticating, am I who I am, who I say I am, right? And so the identity of the foods, are those foods that we're ordering or the consumers are ordering, are they what they should be, as advertised, or, looking at the supply chain, looking at all these different perspectives, right? The food experience, as Jeffrey was pointing out, right? Like sitting in a restaurant, we want to be able to emulate, or at least provide that experience, to some degree, as close as it can be. And I know we'll get into sort of how the education sort of has shaped our respective perspectives. It's just not to get into that, but just to kind of touch on it. The sort of the aspect of just the various different courses, right? I mean, there was shared history of slavery and capitalism to ethnography, and architecture, understanding different shapes and how that kind of influences our way of thinking, or even our moods, right? And incorporating that into an MBA program, which that in itself was phenomenal, right? And so how then that shapes the sort of the challenges that we're addressing in the platform that we're building. Again, I think to Jeffrey's point is really the underlying theme is compassion and empathy.
Mm-hmm. And I want to stay on that a teeny bit more before we shift towards kind of your nonlinear paths and how Brown influenced kind of or prepared you for these non-traditional approaches to the work. I want to stay in kind of what Jeffrey mentioned about the joy, wanting to have the joy in culinary experiences at the moment, and then also again access in COVID. And I know we're all so tired of COVID. We don't want to talk about it so much anymore, but it is where we are at the moment. So how specifically in COVID, because I think it's customary to hear gloom and doom about restrictions in the current moments and what we can't do and kind of absence of joy. how have you both kind of been pursuing the opposite of that? And one of the reasons that I respond to you both so much is that you have that optimism, you have that sense of curating joy and positive experiences and making lemonade from lemons. So kind of, can you speak to, previous to the pandemic, you would have been doing this anyway, you're still doing it under the constraints of the pandemic. How are you doing it and also finding those optimistic, joyful bits that you both do so well?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in here. I'd say, I would say for most people in the food world, that I feel like I'm a part of, this the pandemic completely upended everyone's plans and everything, and for myself included. A lot of the work that I was doing before the pandemic was a lot of in-person events, cooking. I do a lot of cooking workshops, and I actually lead a culinary heritage tour in Eastern Europe. I was actually teaching a class on culinary anthropology at City College. I was like, everything was in person, and part of that class was we'd go and around New York City and eat together, and I was, everything of mine was canceled. My entire year was canceled. And I, of course, had a moment of freak out, as I'm sure everyone in my position did. I was also lucky not to have a restaurant. All my friends with restaurants themselves were all struggling and trying to figure out how to make this thing work. And I think after like a few weeks and also adapting to doing a bunch of programs on Zoom and everything, I think that there was a moment when all these chefs and all these people I knew in the food world were all not working, but there was kind of an energy. Like I was getting calls from people who wanted to kind of collaborate on new projects. People wanted to, write a book, and they wanted to ask me. I worked on a cookbook before. They wanted to ask me about my cookbook. I wound up, after talking to a number of folks, chefs and people, and also talking to a number of funders who really wanted to, in the Jewish world, who wanted to support a lot of Jewish chefs and restaurants that are hurting, and wanted to also help get food to people who needed it. I somehow managed to pull together enough people to create a 10-day virtual food fest, which I was like, I've been to many food conferences and many food events and festivals in my life. It's like, what could this be like? What could a virtual food festival be like? And because some of the top chefs in the world were just available and not doing anything and looking to connect with people, they were all around, and they all said, I'll come, I'll cook something. And I was amazed to see how I did an event with 3 chefs from 3 different parts of the world cooking Shabbat dinner together. And to see that we can actually get the feeling of Shabbat, of the Sabbath, on screen for people. It was incredible, and to get to do it. And by the way, and the whole purpose of this was to pay these chefs and to pay them for their time and to support folks. It was honestly one of the most exciting things in my life, was to be able to kind of create this space, food adjacent. People were cooking along with these chefs, and we did a 10-day festival. We had 25,000 people show up to be a part of it. And we weren't even planning on it being a fundraising event, but there was a demand to do it, and we ended up raising $150,000. We would have raised a lot more had we had more than 4 or 5 weeks to plan this. We did it in the spring of 2020, and to me, I left that feeling like, oh my gosh, like what's possible right now? It's endless. And I started to see all these restaurants adapting to delivery and takeout as well, and starting to see a lot of restaurants, start shipping, and a lot of them they were working with third parties. They started doing it themselves. Restaurants were trying anything and everything to figure out how to make it work. And it was just it still feels some ways like it's a moment of possibility. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I can't tell you how many new restaurants have been opening up, and how many of them are new kinds of restaurants. In Prospect Heights, Brooklyn, for some reason, all of these queer restaurants are opening up. So there's and a lot of them act as these queer culinary hubs that invite other queer chefs to come host pop-ups at their restaurant. And there's a queer Hungarian place that just opened right by me, a queer New Mexican spot, a queer cafe that's also a queer wine shop, and a company that's based there that makes these beautiful Jell-O cakes, and then they host pop-ups as well. This was not happening 2 years ago. And so the fact that in this moment, kind of young new voices have been elevated and have been motivated and have been able to find the resources to be able to open these kind of places, the food landscape's going to look different, but it's going to be more inclusive. And there's an excitement. Each of these new places, there's lines around the block, people waiting outside to eat burritos from the New Mexican spot in the cold weather because they're so exciting and so delicious. So for me, I mean, I see a lot of excitement, and the work that Miheer and I are doing in the delivery landscape this is also the new reality. And I was hesitant. I actually hardly ever ordered delivery. I like to cook myself, or I'll go and eat in a restaurant. But I've had to adapt myself, and I saw a lot of room for innovation here as well. And so for me, it's exciting to think about what how if the right people, if the right chef thinks about making the right vegan cheesesteak, you can accomplish something pretty delicious. And so that's how I would answer your question, Emily. But Miheer, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Absolutely.
That's right. I mean, we're a very intriguing and interesting species. when we're pushed to do something, right? Like we'll just instinctively kind of step up. You know, that's sort of one aspect. And then sort of the other aspect that I've kind of observed subtly is sort of the louder voice. You know, it was almost like the gas was taken out from as the queer New Mexican establishment, the wine bar, etc. They started popping up. And so, you know, these sort of the voices that may have been sort of pushed aside, you know, it's almost like they were able to sort of level the playing field, and then they were able to come in and say, look, you know, I'll, you know, try this out. And then, you know, so it was, I mean, there's innovation, absurd amount of innovation, I think has taken place, that is taking place, that will take place, you know, through the pandemic. And I think that's the optimism that I have with, I think, the species, right? Like, I mean, it's just so fascinating, you know, just how interconnected we are. And I think we're realizing that interconnectedness and the interdependency that we have, you know, to each other, with each other. And I love it. You know, it's bringing so many people together. I mean, so many Zoom calls, you know, I'm still, and I'm a huge believer in karmic theory, and, you know, maybe there's good sort of karmic merit that brought, you know, Emily and I together, which then, you know, brought Jeffrey and I together, and here we are, right? It's a multiplier effect, right? So I think, you know, there's just, I can just go on and on about this question, but yeah, Emily, I'd say the human species, don't ever discount. We are what we can do.
Don't ever discount. I like that. You guys are both giving me battery life for the rest of the week, so thank you for that. And just one final question before we get to the Q&A, because I do want to honor the lovely questions that folks are entering in. You both have worn many hats in the path to kind of where you are currently. You still probably do wear many hats and balance the tasks and the roles that you have in Jeffrey in the food space, Miheer as someone who's in cybersecurity, but really is spending a huge part of his heart and time on your burgeoning startup. How can you talk a bit about that peripatetic path to where you are, and also kind of how Brown prepared you to that? Because I look at both of you, when I read your bios initially, I was just like, God, there's something so Brown about both of you. And that's so annoying, but so true at the same time. And then we're all the time saying, oh, that's so Brown, what does that mean? But you are, you exemplify that. So Can you talk a little bit about your non-traditional pathways to where you are, and also kind of how Brown prepared you to wear so many hats?
Yeah, like loaded question. You can probably keep going, but
Loaded, yeah.
I'll make this quick. I know we want to get to the question.
We'll be on until tomorrow at this point.
Gosh, I think there was a seed that was planted in me, I'd say probably in 2015 or 16. Long story short, Srimati Rajchandra, who was the spiritual guide for Gandhi, I was introduced to his philosophy, and that sort of led me down a path of looking at how can business be conducted with honor, with integrity, with trust, with just doing good for everybody around us, right? And then in 2018, looking at different MBA programs, your traditional sort of programs, they just weren't giving me sort of that comfort, that sense of this curiosity of like, oh wow, okay, I can actually derive some value that I can actually then turn that into something great. But this program, it was I think the key sort of value proposition that really struck out at me was reflective leadership. And I think from Brown's perspective, I think reflective sort of asking questions, this curiosity, right? I think that was the sort of the bigger element in how that really pushed me into this passion. And honestly, it was that's where I crossed paths with really phenomenal individuals that I'm partnering with on this venture. And so I just feel fortunate, for the whole experience. I mean, again, I can keep on and on. There's just so many examples and experiences that I can talk about. But Jeffrey, I'd love to hear your perspective. I know you've done some really cool things during your time at Brown.
Well, I mean, Brown was, like, I owe a lot to my experiences at Brown in terms of my work in food, even though there was no actual formal food programs necessarily, but something about the culture of the place. So I first started thinking intellectually about food because I took a class with Gordon Wood, the famous American revolutionary scholar, and I got my first C when I wrote a terrible paper in his class on the American Revolution on taxation. And what do I care about taxation? It didn't really matter that much to me. And my TA said to me, he said, why don't you find something that's much more interesting to you, and we'll adjust the assignment for the next essay and go with that. This is my freshman year, second semester, and my first year, excuse me. Forgot who I was talking to here. And I ended up writing about tea. And I should say that I was always interested in, my essay to get into Brown was about making interesting sandwiches. I was always thinking about food and tea. Beyond the tea party, I was curious about it. And I started researching this topic. And it turned out that it was so fascinating. All I wanted to do was talk with my friends about what I was researching. And I loved the experience. I wrote this fantastic essay. I got an A+. I ended up rounding out my grade to A-, but at Brown, of course, that becomes an A because there's no minuses or pluses. And I was like, can I keep this going? Can I just keep on writing about food? And I was a history concentrator, and I wrote about potatoes in my class on Latin American civilization. I studied abroad in South Africa, and I ended up doing a semester-long project on apartheid and the fishing industry in the 1950s, and an attempt to sneak fish into the diet of Black South Africans. And I just ended up writing my honors thesis, which is sort of how I started getting into what I've been doing now for a long time, on the industrialization of the kosher food industry in post-war America. And that was, for me, an eye-opening experience, because I got to both see how food traditions and my own food culture got Americanized, mass-produced, I literally saw how gefilte fish, one of my favorite foods, was stuffed into a jar and became the laughingstock of my food tradition. And I saw how this industry was had grown, and at the same time was all about establishing trust and trust with the consumer, because there was a problem. There was all this fraud, and no one could trust if their butcher was selling them kosher meat or not. But what ended up happening was I also saw how trust was taken out of local communities and sort of centralized, mostly actually in Brooklyn, where most of the koshering authorities are, and people actually got disconnected from even knowing how to prepare kosher food at home, because now you could just go to the supermarket. This was the newest American Jewish ritual, was you could look and see a symbol, a hechsher on the packages. And so, and this was the first symbol. Now today you go and you see organic, you see, maybe you'll see vegan, you'll see halal, you'll see gluten-free. The first symbol was the kosher symbol. Completely transformed the way supermarket shopping was done. And so for me, I see actually some of that work now in doing that, what I'm doing in the plant-based space, but actually my work in the Jewish food space was to sort of push back against that industrialization and to kind of reconnect with making foods from scratch. And so I started a company called Gefilteria that essentially we started making a sustainably produced, handmade gefilte fish that we would sell. Because the gefilte fish that was sold in stores, the sourcing was terrible. It looked bad. No one wanted to eat it. That wasn't very good. And that launched for me a decade essentially of reimagining Jewish foods. And I wrote a cookbook called the Gefilte Manifesto. And so that all started at Brown. I graduated from Brown. I literally moved from Brown onto an organic farm. And I had a lot of experiences there. I also, learned to make naturally fermented pickles. There's a whole thing. But right after that summer on the farm, I actually had a year funded by Brown on the Arnold Fellowship, where I spent a year researching the pork industry in Israel. Because the Arnold Fellowship was funding a study that was connected to your honors thesis. So instead of studying the kosher industry in America, I said, what does the non-kosher industry look like in Israel? I got on the pork industry, and it was there that I actually worked on my first industrial farm. I worked on a quasi-legal industrial pig farm, and it was an incredible experience in some ways. Culturally, I was working on raising pigs with a Palestinian Muslim who doesn't eat pork, a former Hasidic Brazilian Jew who had just cut his payas off the day before he arrived on the farm and lied to his father, told him he was studying Talmud. Instead, he was actually cleaning up after the pigs with me. But it was there that I saw what industrial animal agriculture looked like for the first time. I was working in a confined animal feeding operation. I was seeing a lot of the problems with our food system firsthand. And it really informed a lot of how I continue to think about food. And I actually went there to study the history and the culture. And one of my biggest takeaways was how problematic the whole industry is. And so there's so many other ways that Brown has impacted my choices, my interests. But I'd say directly, through my intellectual study, I stumbled upon areas of interest that have fueled me for this is going to be my 15th reunion year. So, yeah.
Amazing. And I think the common denominator for both of you, Miheer used this earlier, the word curious. Curiosity definitely unites the two of you and is what draws me and so many people to you. I want to shift to as many questions as we can get to in our remaining few minutes. But kind of tying back to our middle section of the conversation with respect to food access. Liz Resnick said that you've both talked about access as it pertains to dining out in COVID times with a shift to takeout, access to high quality, trustworthy food for people with special diets. But what about access for those who can't afford restaurant food to begin with? It's a question that hits dear to my heart, coming from a working class background. It's a real question. So can you both speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. So, part of that's part of the challenge that we're, working on, right, for the platform. So looking at so average consumer in the US, for example, lives about 2.6 to 3 miles from a grocery store, right? And so, that's already a established food center, sort of, right? So, and how we look at the chefs that we work with, and the menus that we create, right? They're going to be sort of unique and different across the board, right? For example, in the DC area, there's you have your spectrum of grocery stores, right? So you have the Giant Foods, you have the Whole Foods, you have Sprouts, you have Mom's Organic, et cetera, et cetera. And so, each of these, what we've learned is, there's different demographics that, goes to shop at these respective types of grocers. And so, with the menus that we also create, therefore, we want to be able to expose, number one, the phenomenal chefs that are out there, right, that are creating these plant-based foods, but then also thinking about, increasing access to the broader community, right? And how we even source the different ingredients, the different materials, packaging, et cetera, that's going to be focused around, and built around, these different communities. So, for sure, I mean, it's the healthy foods, but yet still delicious, fun, filling, that needs to be sort of broadly accessible. And that is one of the bigger challenges, right? That's that we all know of. So, yeah, Jeffrey, I know you're also working on that aspect in some
I
form.
mean, this is the hardest thing ever, and it's such a valuable question. And I mean, honestly, the more and more I've spent time in the food space, and the more I've spent time in the restaurant industry, it's just how it's just geared more and more towards those who can afford it, and it really and for these restaurants that are struggling to stay open, like right now with inflation and everything, and the cost of goods rising, it's just they're trying to stay afloat. And so one of the, I mean, I wish I could say we were trying to confront this head on, and there are some great initiatives. I have some friends working on, there's an app called Too Good To Go, which is sort of pairing food waste with restaurant supply. And so when restaurants have too much food and they don't want it to go to waste, they can sell it at the end of the night for a discount. And through the app, you can find out who's doing that and who has too much. And so there are some interesting technological solutions that are kind of out there. And there's organizations like, Rethink Food that are partnering with restaurants and kind of creating these initiatives to really serve those who otherwise maybe can't afford some of these higher end experiences. Simply speaking, one of the things that we're just trying to do is create efficiencies where there aren't efficiencies to bring down costs. Sometimes that means something as simple as really encouraging pre-order of restaurant meals, so a restaurant can know exactly how much they need to prepare, so there is less waste, because every restaurant factors waste into how they're thinking about what they're going to make. I was just in Philly with cooking this meal for New Year's with my friend, and he is a thoughtful chef. He works with food from the best restaurants, but he is also a resourceful chef, and a really good chef is resourceful. So he doesn't let anything go to waste. So one of the ways of building efficiencies is actually cooking with zero waste. And so for me, from an environmental perspective, I'm very interested in that, but also it also connects me to my shtetl history and background, my family from the small towns of Eastern Europe where nothing would go to waste. So my friend Ari literally keeps the apple peels and freezes them and uses them to add flavor to stocks, because he doesn't want to waste those apple peels. And it turns out apple peels actually add a really nice sweetness and tang to vegetable stock. And he'll cook them down to make sauce from the apple peels. And the amount of things that he pulled out, we were trying to make a vegan stock together, and the stock was not coming together nicely. And the things he pulled out of his fridge to use, because he was not going to let go to waste. We put in pickle brine. We put in, he had made a miso butter, but he had the buttermilk stored to be used in a moment like this. So it wasn't actually vegan stock, but he threw the buttermilk in. To me, it showed what running a good restaurant looks like. It is zero waste. And if you have an efficient restaurant, you're going to bring down those costs. And it's really the amount of inefficiency that exists right now in the restaurant space, and especially in high-end restaurants. There's not too much consideration always in terms, it's usually about sometimes what is the fastest and most quickest way to prepare a meal. And but there are these initiatives out there. So I'm kind of thinking a lot about that. And we're not yet doing our own ghost kitchens or own virtual brand concepts. But as we think about those, I want to make zero waste a huge part of what we do. And so that's just one of the ways I'm thinking about it. But I wish that there's so many, one of the hard things about working with a startup is that there's so many different areas you can go. And when you're kind of starting, you kind of need to be narrow, and then you need to expand how you're thinking about it. And so we're kind of starting a little bit more narrowly, but we want to be addressing those issues as we go forward. But I really appreciate the question.
Yeah. And Jeffrey, our grandmothers would be so appreciative and proud of us for talking about this. I have a sense. So one last question, quick round robin, because I do want to end on time. Margarita asked about compensation, talking about how small farmers in particular and hospitality workers have a hard time being fairly compensated in good times, let alone bad times. So how are you both thinking about that in these lean times in which we find ourselves?
Yeah, that's another labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going back to compassion and empathy, right? I've worked in a kitchen briefly, like in my college years, and it's a tough environment. It's often somebody shows up before sunrise and leaves after sunset, right? It's hot, there's grease, there's just it's a miserable environment. And on top of that, the compensation doesn't equate to food is life, right? And from that perspective, the workers they're not treated as such, right? Where it's part of, if you need that to sustain life. So one of the aspects, again, from an operational point of view, we are wanting to look at the metrics, the economics, right, of how that sort of works in the platform. And that's where we're putting in a significant effort in terms of what that looks like. How that ties into the ESG metrics, for example, environmental, social governance metrics, looking at B Lab or B Corp certification, companies like Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, et cetera, that are sort of looking at this sort of variable, right, and the treatment of the workforce and what that kind of looks like. So that is one of the challenges that we're looking to solve with this platform. And so it's sadly, it's again been such a critical issue. But again, with this pandemic, the innovation that's taking place, and also the amount of light that's being shed right on this particular topic. And again, thank you for the question, Margaret. So I'm hopeful for us, but also it's a multiplier effect where a lot of the hospitality, food and beverage industry are being forced to think about compensation and things like that. So
I'll just say this is perhaps one of the most radical times in hospitality and the restaurant industry. Farms are feeling it as well, and change needs to happen because a lot of restaurants can't staff up. They just can't get people to work, and most people I know who own restaurants know that the system is completely messed up, and it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense, and so I think you are going to see when restaurants aren't just trying to survive but are able to actually move forward. You're going to see a lot of lobbying for change, more than there's ever been. And but it is a completely unsustainable system right now. So you are seeing some of the efforts. Some of the drivers now for some of the big delivery companies are starting to be paid hourly instead of by delivery, so they're not so they can have more security and stability. And some of them are actually being paid as full employees. And so some of the pushes and the lobbying that has gone into effect has been helpful for the past couple of years. And some of the legal the laws and the books that mandated certain minimums, also just for restaurant workers as well, they've come into play. It's been really helpful. And all I can say is more and more young people that are supported going into the field. I'm seeing all this new crop of restaurant owners who are thinking about the workers, building communities for the workers. There's a way that they're thinking about the industry that completely bucks convention. And so I think just kind of supporting also really great local restaurants, supporting folks that wear their values on their sleeve with what they're serving and cooking, I think is a great way to make sure that we're going to see those changes take place.
Wonderful. All right, everyone, we are at time. So I do want to be respectful of that. I feel like we could have an all-night dorm conversation, everybody at Brown, if we could keep talking about this. Thank you, Jeffrey and Miheer, so much for sharing your enthusiasm and your innovative ideas. It's kind of a bright light in a dark moment. So we thank you so much. Thank you also to the Brown Club of New York for all of your support for this event here from DC. And also we had lovely support from the Brown RISD Hillel group and then also the Brown Alumni Entrepreneurship Group who brought their folks to the table as well. So thanks everyone for gathering. We'll do our best to get to the unanswered questions offline, but to everyone who showed up, to our speakers, thank you so much for joining us.
So good to see some familiar names as well. And
yeah.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Emily.
Cheers.
Bye.